Hey. So just before I start, I feel I should warn you this is City Side 1, the Apple Q&A is next door. But for those of you who have taken the red pill, welcome. My name's Geoff Lowe. I work at a company called Mediated Solutions. I'm a principal innovation scientist there, and our primary business is building software for clinical trials, so data capture and everything like that. The purpose of my presentation today is just giving a lot of you who may have a little bit of understanding about what goes on in a clinical trial, just a wee bit more sort of coverage about it, and start looking for opportunities to where we can start working, to look where we can start working together, because it's such a painful process at the moment for all concerned. When I'm talking about the sponsors, I'm talking about the sites, and I'm talking specifically about the patients as well, because that's the most important thing. So what we're going to talk about today is sort of just an overview of what a research trial is, what do we actually need to do as part of the data collection for a clinical trial, and then look at some of the opportunities that we on the research side are starting to see with respect to the use and reuse of healthcare data and research. So just as a bit of background, I'm sure you're all aware when you look at the bill for any time you go to the doctor, I'm assuming obviously in the US, it's less so in the European Union, it's quite a large industry. Sales are around 1.1 trillion 2017, and that's just in the US, of course. But one of the things sort of comes part and parcel with that is you need to actually get these drugs in the hands of people. And what we're discovering, sort of for reasons that I'll go into a wee bit, is it's actually getting more and more expensive to get a drug to market, which is kind of counter to what you would imagine in terms of we're getting better at data collection. We've got activities like machine learning to draw more sort of context or interest from the data itself, but still it's costing more and more money to actually get drugs to market. And sort of the analysis of this comes down to sort of four main areas. The first one's the so-called better than the Beatles problem, in terms of a lot of the drugs that are coming to market aren't really, they're not blockbusters, not new drugs by and large. A lot of them are sort of subtle reformulations or slightly better statins, for example, which are obviously good for the company itself, but it becomes harder and harder to actually prove the value of that drug. So if you're bringing something to the market which is slightly better than something else, you've got to spend a lot more time capturing a lot more data to actually prove that the drug itself is better and has value when you're trying to sell it to the insurance companies and trying to sell it to the national health systems. The cautious regulator is the other one. Obviously, there's been a number of very, very large snafus, for want of a better word, in the drug industry, where despite extensive collection of data, extensive analysis, everything like that, we still get through and we find patterns of like unexpected events or serious adverse events. The ones that probably spring to mind at most are Vioxx in the most recent memory. So the regulators themselves are kicking back to say, okay, have you tested, have you looked at more and more of this data? We don't want to have another one of these things on our hands. Again, this is like the Mythical Man Month situation, where in the past, if you thought you had a problem you had to solve, well, the easiest way you could solve it is by throwing more people at it, which is sort of the way you'd think. The trouble was, obviously, that never actually works. It ends up being sort of about 50% longer if you just left with the steady as can be. So they're throwing more and more resource to try and get these studies done quicker and quicker, and it's turning out that they're actually taking longer and costing more. And the final one is a lot of the low-hanging fruit has kind of been picked at this point. So you get into drugs which are much more sophisticated. The way they act with the human body are much more innate. And in a lot of cases, we don't actually understand it completely. So we pick up a drug or a specific compound, we try it out, we think we understand how it works, then we start giving it to patients themselves, and we see things that we hadn't anticipated, and you have to go back to the drawing board. So a lot of it's a lot harder to actually work out what these drugs do, because the targets themselves are much more sophisticated. So there's a sort of an estimate, and this obviously goes up and down depending on who you're talking to, but they reckon it takes about 12 years to get to market, or around 1.15 billion pounds. So that's obviously in sterling. But what in and of itself is the sort of the reason for running a clinical trial. You need to be able to prove that this compound or this intervention, we're not just talking about drugs themselves, we're also talking about new medical devices, even some the types of treatments you could do, like psychological, those sorts of things. You need to be able to prove that this intervention, which is sort of that high-level term, is safe, i.e. it doesn't cause more problems than it cures, and it's efficacious. And this leads back to the better than the Beatles problem in terms of you need to be able to prove that the drug actually does what it says it's going to do. There's two sort of generally main types of clinical trials, or two types of trials. There's the clinical trial. They're generally broken down to things like open label, blinded, placebo-controlled, just different types of interventional experiments where you actually give somebody a drug and look to see what happens. The other one is observationals, where you don't actually get involved with them quite so much. All you do is you gather their data, and then you see what insight you can draw from that at the end of the day. But either way, we need data and we need lots of it. So this is a nice diagram that I found, the reference you see in the corner there, which talks about the sort of the high-level process of getting a drug through. Obviously, you have to find the drug for its staff. All the preclinical stuff happens before this. You find a compound, you identify it based on maybe a deeper understanding of proteins, for example, and then you're committing to actually putting together a study. You start off by creating defining the study, how it's going to work. You put together some documents which cover what you're going to do as part of the study, how you can analyze the data, how you're going to prove one way or another that the drug is safe, how you're going to prove one way or another that it's efficacious. Then you spend quite a bit of time within the data collection phase. We start off with participant enrollment, where we start pulling people in, or identifying patients or suitable patients for the study itself, and collect data for a period of time. How long you collect the data depends on what phase the study is. There's sort of basically four main stages or phases of study. There's phase one, where you just actually look at the profile of the drug, how it works in a normal person, for want of a better word, see how it decays, those sorts of, you start off very low and you look to see whether or not there's any adverse events or anything like that. And then you get into phase 2 and 3 when you actually start looking at its benefit for therapeutic users. And then phase 4 is sort of more post-marketing. When you've done all your studies, you've proved that it works with the sample population that you put into your study, and then you just keep an eye on it. You run studies on like different ethnographic groups. A great example is, for example, the metabolism of Japanese people, Asian people, is different to the metabolism of Western people. So quite often they run post-marketing studies in Japan just simply because they're not absolutely 100% sure the drug is going to work the way they thought it might. After they've done all this data collection, they spend a lot of time cleaning it, a lot of time putting it together into tables, listings, and figures, and then at the end of the day, you submit it to the regulatory agency. So in the US, it's obviously the FDA. In the UK, it's the MHRA. Basically, these groups are the ones that give you the go, no-go on the drug itself, or permission to market it. The document that's key, obviously, to everything is the clinical trial protocol. The clinical trial protocol is for an individual study within sort of a wider program because, like I said, there's a number of different phases in terms of how you're going to run the study. Clinical trial program protocol talks about a single study, a single intervention where you have one or more outcomes and endpoints, sort of breakdown of how you're going to collect the data, the types of this concept, like for example study arms. You want to compare that the drug works equally. The placebo-controlled study is an example where you say, okay, I'm going to give 50% of the population are going to get a sugar pill, or want for a better word, and the other 50% are going to get the drug, and that's intended to wipe out the placebo effect. That sort of study design goes into the protocol document itself. It also includes what we call the schedule of activities, the schedule of events, which includes all the activities you're going to do as part of the study. So it includes like encounters when you're going to see the investigator, what procedures you're actually going to do when you go in and talk to the investigator themselves. It's really important for actually defining everything. This is a controlled document. It's versioned, it's very much managed, and this is the one that goes to regulators for review. It also goes to the institutional review boards. If you don't get past the institutional review board, you're not even going to be able to run the study in a particular site. And one of the things I wanted to give an example of, as part of the clinical trial protocol, is defining your patient population, and that's done through something called eligibility criteria. It broadly breaks down to two types. There's the inclusion criteria, which is a set of criteria which prospective participants must match, and the exclusion, which is obviously the vice versa. I've put asterisks on there because there is actually quite often a degree of investigator discretion to say, in some cases, if you're talking a very, very small patient population, the investigator can overrule one or more of these. One of the problems we've had in the past in terms of being able to identify patients is the way, a lot of it boils down to the way we express the inclusion-exclusion criteria. They're written by medical writers who are physicians, and they have a particular turn of phrase which really it has a lot of difficulty being decomposed into something machine processable. So in this case here, we've got male or female patients with a diagnosis of PH or persistent recurrent chronic CTEPH. Age greater than or equal 18 years, well, that's relatively simple. Baseline 6-minute walk test. There's just a list of all these things here. But a lot of these things, a lot of the rules themselves are written in a very composite way, so it becomes very difficult for machines to process. Similarly, exclusion criteria, hypersensitivity to nickel. That's just saying that one of the interventions they're going to use as part of the study is a Fitbit, and the Fitbit class has nickel into it, so you don't want to admit patients into the study for that. So any of these sorts of things, a medical condition or history such would impair the patient's ability to participate or complete the study in the opinion of the investigator. Try turning that into a series of where-ifs. Enrolled in pulmonary rehabilitation program within the last 6 months, already participating in an interventional study. So I've just taken a selection here and actually turned them, they are quite simplistic themselves, but we have a case here, age greater than 18 years. Obviously we can do a query on the patient resource. Male or female, same sort of thing. The condition, one or other. They're talking about one of these things. I think it's probably exclusive, or I don't know if you can have these two things at the same time. I'm not a clinician. And then a not. So the first block there are a series of ands, and then there's or in the middle in there, and then there's not. So actually composing that into a series of queries you might need to run becomes quite difficult. There has been some suggestion of actually making that simpler to implement, but medical writers can be a bit particular. So here's an example of just some code that I put together to illustrate how you can do this. This is obviously it's written in Python. It's using the FHIR client, which Pascal wrote. So obviously there's some very simple ones there about pulling out particular conditions like gender, age, and everything like that. And then this example here, there's a number of clinical trial registries across the world, which basically we register your study to let people know that it exists so they can find it. And they tend to do these things using mesh terms. So essentially, this is the kind of thing you would start putting together to start identifying patient participants for your study. The code itself is all up on that site there. There's also exercises which reference that. Now you might say, well, these seem relatively simple. What's the benefit of it? Well, as stated there, approximately 29% of the clinical trial cost is down to recruitment, identifying subjects. 29% of whatever they're spending. So if we could actually get to the position where we could use FHIR resources, like to identify patients populations of patients from systems automatically, then we could be saving up to $37,000 a day in terms of the recruitment process. We would also, I mean, you might be looking at the dollar sign thinking, well, that's very cynical of you, but it's also shrinking the amount of time it's going to take you to get that drug to market. And if these drugs are genuinely going to improve people's lives, then I think we have a moral responsibility to try and facilitate that as much as possible. So there is a dollar value associated with it, but there's also a human value associated with it. Now, we're not the first people to obviously look at some of this clinical trial perspective. There's been some projects already run within the FHIR work stream. So there was the structured data capture stream, which I think Lloyd's presenting on tomorrow, in fact. And under that, there was a couple of resources that were put together that we're looking to use, and I'm just going to sort of cover them very briefly in a minute. So they're kicked off as part of the structured data capture stream. That went away to a degree, but since that time, the Biomedical Research and Regulatory Group have taken those resources on and are sponsoring them, stewarding them through the ballot process. For those of you who aren't aware of the Biomedical Research and Regulatory Group, it's a conglomeration of the old RCRIM, which is the Research-Centered Reference Information Model Group, and the Bridge Working Groups. Bridge is a model that was intended to harmonise the two different domains, the healthcare and the research. It's arguable whether it's been able to do that, but it's still carrying on as it is. So the first one we're going to look at is the research study. So it's obviously capturing the information about the study. So if you were to take a protocol, this is what you would get out of that. So the resource itself, I don't know how well that's going to show up, is pretty well. So there's, this is still, the research study and research subject are actually under a sort of more active review, so there's a couple of differences between the two levels. So I've got both copies here, but the key constituents are quite obvious. There's obviously an identifier for the study, the title, the protocol. Now this is one that I'm going to talk about in a bit, but it's kind of interesting because it's one place that serves as a really good opportunity for us to work together on. The status of a study can be in any one of a number of states. These things can be quite fluctuational in terms of, say, they discover an issue with the drug in one of the centres, they'll shut them down, and all the other ones, they will stop recruitment at other ones to make until they're sure it's all okay. There's things there which will help you actually find a study, because the biggest thing about it is if you have a study itself is usually associated with a compound, obviously, or an intervention itself, and a particular one or more therapeutic areas, which are just conditions themselves. So there's a lot of the queries that you could do based on that. But all in of itself, it's a good coverage for what we can use at this point. I talked very briefly about the arms. The arms are basically, from a high level, they summarise a path for a patient through a study itself. So some studies are designed in such a way that you actually have a different path depending on what disease you are. So say you have a study that's running both asthma and COPD, the types of assessments you'll do on those sort of patients, even though you're using the same interventional method, will be different. I mean, you'll be randomised to one of those arms, or you'll be allocated to one of those arms based on your underlying disease. And so it's intended within this resource to be able to represent that. References to the sites. So again, a lot of this is about sort of advertising that the study exists and you're able to find it. The ones that have really changed between the two are, so a lot of the clinicians got involved, I don't actually think they were necessarily clinicians, they were more sort of clinical trial operators, so CROs and those sort of things. So the statuses themselves have become a lot more pinned down, I guess. So there's a lot more different options. But they're intended to give you better information as a person who's consuming this resource about the status of the study. Is it active? Are you going to be able to recruit patients into it? Does it make sense to do that? One of the things that I think was very good in the R4 resources, in R3 they had a single entity called Focus, which talked about the focus of the study. Which was, it could be one or two things. One of them could be the actual medication or the intervention that was being used. And the other one was the condition. So both of those things were encapsulated in the same attribute. That's obviously now been split out, so you can actually sort of do a more discrete search for a condition because it is its own attribute. So some of the uses we could see for research study. Study registration, obviously you want to have some record of the study in the EHR system. And I'll talk about the research subject in a minute because that's kind of tying it all together. But it allows you to have some way of representing information from a protocol document in a machine processable way so that you could actually find it and draw sort of actionable insights based on that. That's a big word, but it's about having a way of exchanging this information. There have been a number of attempts on the clinical research side to try and build a model for protocols. I wouldn't say they've been overly successful. The trouble with a protocol itself is everybody's convinced that their way is the right way. So there's been a lot of attempts to try and harmonise the underlying model of the protocol itself, be able to represent the information in the same way for the reasons that we've talked about prior. And just up to now, there hasn't been kind of the impetus on the research side to really tie it all together. There has been some work done by the Transallerate group to try and actually do that. So they've got a common protocol template. And the big thing was, I talked about the fact that the medical writers are the people who write the protocols. They are very opinionated and very difficult to sell new ideas to. So they're quite conservative, which is quite something considering our industry is generally pretty conservative. The other thing you can do about it is you can actually allow people to be able to find studies based on like attributes. So this is the one where it becomes quite interesting for the like CDS hooks, the subscription resources, where you want to be able to, say you find someone who's been newly diagnosed with a particular condition, you want to know if there's clinical studies out there. There was a study relatively recently which said, I think if given the opportunity, 90% of all people would participate in a clinical study. And that was sort of from a humanic perspective rather than, because you can't recompense people as part of the clinical study because that introduces all sorts of biases. But allowing people to actually find these studies would be absolutely amazing, and especially if you could do it in such a way as you could install a clinical decision support hook in a number of EHR systems, and then any time any patient comes up and says, with a particular condition, you could pop it up and say, okay, here's a research study that they are suitable for attending. So suddenly you're actually taking the study to them rather than actually having to go and find it yourself. And then finally, registering the subject. You need to be able to register a subject to a study. I don't have a little bit of time. So I've got an example here. So in this case, like I said, there are clinical trial registries. And so, exercises. So the clinical trial, the biggest clinical trial registry is obviously the clinicaltrials.gov, which is run in the US. I can't remember the organisation who run it. But essentially, anytime if you're going to run a study in North America, you have to have registered the study with clinicaltrials.gov before you're allowed to start. That includes a lot of sort of key information, again intended to try and allow people to find studies, allow investigators to find studies, not necessarily just participants. The clinicaltrials.gov is a pretty well maintained model, but one of the things I've always thought would be kind of interesting is to see whether or not we could kind of bring their representation of the data together with, for example, the research study. So I've got a little bit of code here, which is somewhat hard to see. But again, it's so I've written a wee library which will pull down because you can download the trial specifications from clinicaltrials.gov just as an XML document, and I've written a wrapper around that to extract all the relevant attributes from that. So one of the attributes themselves is you want to be able to identify all the locations in which the study is running. Clinicaltrials.gov will allow you to capture the countries in which the study is running, the actual sites, some of the investigators, and identify the people who are involved. So essentially, I've just written a little wrap around this. This is also available on GitHub. You can download it, and it will pull the XML document down and then render it as a series of attributes. And then we can start mapping those attributes across to FHIR resources. So this is an example where we've, there was the keywords as a way of finding the study. Well, similarly in the clinicaltrials.gov, they have a couple of keywords, or they have a series of keywords that you can use for looking up the drug, looking up the study itself based on drugs or intervention or condition. So essentially, we kind of pull all of those things into one attribute collection, and then we can then just load them across into the research study resource. So again, I mean, a lot of this was kind of was interesting to me because I think one of the problems we have at the moment for people who are looking to implement some of these research resources is there aren't enough examples. So the resource itself has been published, but there's no examples. So anybody who wants to come along and pick it up is kind of a wee bit at sea because they don't have some examples to look at. I don't know about you, but when I'm certainly looking at new resources, I spend a lot of time looking at the examples because they help discombobulate some of the ideas in your head. So the next one is the research subject. So this is predicated on the fact that you actually have built a research or registered a research study in the system of choice. And essentially what this does is it ties off the connection between a patient, who is obviously an entity within a resource within the EHR system, and a research study. So then you can, it also includes things, information about arm allocations, something like that, but it's basically the join between these two things. Because obviously in the healthcare system, I as a patient have a particular resource, so I have an NHS number, but I don't want to share that with a pharmaceutical company, so I need to have some way of bridging that. So in the EDC system, I have an identifier, subject 1, 2, 3, 4, for example. What the research subject does is it allows you to have those two, exist as those two entities in the two different systems without necessarily tying them together, because it's very, very bad if the pharmaceutical company ever gets any sort of personally identifying information which would allow them to identify the subjects. So again, this one's reasonably simple in terms of there's not a lot to it. There's not a lot you need around it. But again, it just ties off the identifier, the reference to the study, the reference to the individual, the patient themselves. The identifier in this case would be probably the subject 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as an example. Their status, whether or not they're interested in taking part in a study, whether they're actually participating in a study, whether they didn't meet the requirements, the eligibility requirements to take part in a study, whether they completed a study on time, whether they withdrew from a study. Each of these are states on the states or subject milestones for people who are taking part in a clinical study. And this is a great resource for being able to kind of tie that together, because information about whether or not you're going to take part in a study may exist in a completely different system. But because it's an open resource, if we have a decision that's made by a pharmaceutical company not to move forward with the patient or something like that, you can just push that back as a put request. And voila, the data is harmonized. There's not as many changes here apart from a lot more statuses. Again, based down to sort of more operational requirements. I have a wee bit of a problem between the STU3 and the R4 in terms of it's not necessarily a one-to-one mapping between the two. In the previous one, you had an active, and this one here, you've got several which would be, which could be considered as active. So you've got to try and bridge those two things would be a wee bit sort of conceptually difficult to do. It also includes information like the arm that they've been assigned to, but sometimes they're assigned to an arm, but they don't actually do that arm. I haven't seen many cases for that. Because usually we're not, the systems themselves aren't that sophisticated. Once you're on a path, you're on a path. It also includes, quite interestingly, the consent attribute there. At the moment, consent documents are just that. They have been for a long time, just electronic, basically files that have been signed and put on site. And then there's a date in the EDC system which says this was the date at which they signed informed consent. There's a lot more e-consent going on now, where systems are allowing patients to get a better idea of what they're consenting to as part of the study. Actually having the consent linked in the EHR system to the research subject is pretty interesting, because it allows you to sort of look at that and maybe refresh it from time to time as the protocol changes. So there's some uses which stick out. Obviously, subject registration is the first one. Being able to find anybody who's on a study. Say, for example, you discovered, this is like pie in the sky. This is ridiculous. It wouldn't be as difficult as this. But say you discovered there was an undisclosed serious adverse event for a particular compound. You wanted to stop all subjects who were taking that particular compound. Well, this would be a good way to do it. You could look for the the focus here. You could do a query on the focus and find all the subjects in the research system that are associated with him. And also because, like I said, it's a join between the healthcare system and the research system. So we could use that as basically if we were to do a transaction post in a bundle with all the clinical data, that would be the glue that would join a subject or a patient with a subject, where those they're in the two different systems. Now, with respect to the data capture itself, it's pretty obvious a lot of this, what we're trying to do. We need to capture sort of safety-related data, so labs, vital signs, ECG, those sorts of things. Demographic information, again, is pretty much the patient resource, for want of a better word. And those are sort of the more general ones. So we still need to capture that information. We need to capture it in a reasonable way. Now, the way we used to do this back in the terrible old days was all the forms themselves, which are called case report forms, were sent out in a massive booklet to the site. And anytime you put a new subject on, you would enter all the data. Whatever systems you had alongside, you would then go and copy that data across onto these forms, tear off the top, send the bidder one off by a fax or courier to a data entry site, which would then enter the data. We have to make sure that the data is okay, so we have a series of data validation checks. They would be sent back via fax again to the site for clarification. The site would then send it back. So it was quite a painful process, quite awkward, quite difficult. And at the end of the day, once all the data has been collected and all been cleaned up, the investigator signs off the CRF to say, yes, this is the subject's data for this particular study. Now, this was obviously a long time ago, and I'd love to say that everything's improved, but by and large, I think most of the clinical research these days is just electronic paper. So we're still entering data into copying data into forms. We're not using a pen quite so much. We're just doing it straight there. The advantage we have over the past is the validation. There's no sort of lag time on the validation. As soon as you enter the data, if the data doesn't make sense, say if you enter a blood pressure of 1200, you're instantly going to get informed that that's not valid. It does introduce a small problem, well, it's actually quite a large problem, a source data verification, because one of the things is if you're entering the data as source, which is generally the doctor's note as they're sitting there talking to the patient, you need to make sure that that data gets transcribed correctly into the system. In the way you used to do that with the old paper, you'd have two people enter the same data. You'd give them both a CRF. One would enter it into one screen, one would enter it into another screen, and you'd make sure those two things lined up. The double data entry, it was called, and it was horrible. Now, because they can't do that in the same way with the electronic data capture systems, they have to have somebody go out to site. They don't just do this, they do a number of other things, but the source data verification is just making sure that the data that was captured from the subject is the same as the data that was in the system itself. To give an idea of what a case report form looks like, this is, for example, a vital signs assessment. This is taken from, there's actually a really interesting site, the Medical Data Models, where somebody's just been collecting together a bunch of electronic data forms themselves. The trouble with that is we obviously need to do a lot of, if we were to start pulling the stuff straight from the research systems, we'd need to actually do a lot of mapping. So this is, on the left-hand side is the form itself, right-hand side, we've got a bunch of mappings that we've started putting together. And you'll notice there, one of the problems we do have is the way terminology is handled, healthcare versus research. In research, we tend to pull everything out. We don't have a single med-code that tells us everything about the drug. It doesn't tell us the formulation, it doesn't tell us the route or anything like that. In research, we have to split each of those attributes out, and each of those attributes has to be coded to a specific coding system. So that's going to be a bridge we're going to have to cross at some point. There's an example of taking from a FHIR endpoint. We actually did this at the first FHIR Connectathon that I attended, where we basically point a system at a EHR system, download two sets, like a patient resource and a medication, I think a medication statement or something like that, and then we took that data out and we pushed it across to the EDT system. In that case, it was Mediator Rave, which is my company's system. But the code's up there, so you can take a look. I talked very briefly about eSource. eSource itself is is something that the regulators have been pushing about for a long time. Essentially, it's saying that if you take the data as entered or collected directly by the investigator themselves, you don't need to SDV it. If they're entering it straight into the source system, you don't need to spend a lot of time checking that it's right. If it's entered in the source system and it comes across to your system without any sort of transcription or any way, shape or form, then you don't need to SDV that. The reason that's interesting, there's a couple of definitions of eSource, which I'm not going to go into a great deal. You can have a look at them if you like. Where that becomes really interesting, it's quite a significant, the source data verification can be quite a significant part of the budget for a clinical study. So this is why a lot of the people in our industry are getting behind it, is because if you can do eSource, then you don't need to necessarily spend quite so much time or money collecting the data. Streamlines your costs and also streamlines the amount of time you have to spend collecting data to get it in. But in the future, this can be quite an interesting conversation if you're an EDC vendor and talking to Chuck. There probably won't be two systems like this. There won't be a need necessarily for a research system and a healthcare system. These two things are going to exist hand in glove. Until that time, we still need to kind of work together on this. And this is where FHIR is really interesting, because the previous approach was using things like RFD, which involved moving CCD documents around. CCD documents are not nice. They're very hard for us to process. There's a lot of issues, I think, with actually processing and understanding what they're doing. And just sort of a second, almost last comment. So there's a series of use cases that we've put together for like reuse of healthcare data and research. At the very top of the clock, something called protocol feasibility, where you have access to an anonymized population. Because I talked about the protocol, one of the biggest costs of actually getting a study up and running is you publish your protocol, you send it out to sites, and you can't recruit any subjects because your eligibility criteria are too restrictive. Protocol feasibility use cases, you have basically a blank query which you can run against the patient population, and if you get back 0, you know that you're going to have a lot of difficulty recruiting subjects. So then you'll have to be a wee bit more flexible on your protocol requirements. And that obviously saves a lot of money because you don't have to do protocol amendments, which are a place that money goes to die. The next one is site and subject selection. We talked about that a wee bit in terms of actually being able to find patients for the study. The one next round the clock is basically coordinating between a clinical site or a clinical study and standard of care requirements. So obviously with Medicare in the US, you can get quite a large fine if you ever, even if you do it inadvertently, pass on a research cost to Medicare. So one of the ways, if we have a good exchange between the research system and the healthcare system, we can tell you which procedures can be attributed to research and which ones cannot. The next one is GWAS. It's kind of hard to explain. Come and talk to me if you're interested. And then the final one, or the final one on the outside, is the observational study, where you look back at a lot of data, a very, very large volume of data, essentially, because you've gathered it over many, many years. And you run virtual studies where you say, okay, I have two drugs that are used for same intervention. I look at the patient history over time, and then I look to see if there's any sort of undiagnosed or unidentified unexpected events that happen for people who take this drug versus that drug. And then obviously the big one at the moment in the very centre is what's called the swivel chair problem. The swivel chair problem says essentially a lot of the procedures you're doing as part of a clinical study are the same as the procedures you should be doing in your normal healthcare practice. You're entering concomitant medications, you're entering medical history problems and everything like that. We need that information obviously as part of our clinical trial. So if you only have to enter it once and we can share it across the platform, then that's awesome. So we've got a couple of initiatives that are going on at the moment. I've kind of run out of time. Updates and examples for the research resources. There's a project within the CDIS group looking at like bridging the semantics between the healthcare resources, FHIR resources, and a model that's called CDASH, which is a capture model within CDISC. Integrating the lab data from using the CDISC lab model, which is a wee bit contentious, but it's another thing we can follow down. Actually integrating the grand goal is integrating this FHIR healthcare data into CRFs. And there's something we're going to have a play with at the Baltimore Connectathon, about actually reusing the plan definition Argonaut scheduling to essentially load into a healthcare system all the activities that are part of a clinical study, which will be pretty interesting because it will help sites budget much better, be able to tell the sponsor how much it's going to cost them to run the study. Also, it would go in with the subject calendar, for example, if they're using MyCharts or any other sort of integrated EHR system. That would just be awesome. And that's it. Thank you very much.